In the old city of Jerusalem, there is a man named Moshe who runs a shop in the Jewish quarter. And he's also an Orthodox rabbi and was born and raised in Canada. And so his English is flawless and accentless. You feel like you're talking to a fellow American, but he loves, maybe possibly even more than selling things out of his shop, he loves when groups of American Christians like us show up there and he gets to just share with us what life is like, what it's like to be Jewish and what Jews believe. He's not trying to convert anyone. As he says, you're going to leave still thinking I'm wrong, but at least you'll understand what I believe. And so he's a real engaging guy. As you probably know, life has gotten tougher. It's never been easy to be Jewish in this world, but it's gotten tougher over the past 3 years. And so he's helped a lot of folks understand that a little better. In 22, when we first went to his shop, a group from our church, at the end of it, he said, "What questions do you have?" And he was honest. He was open to any question at all. I could tell. And so I raised my hand, and I was the first one to ask a question. I asked the question that I figured everybody had on their mind, and that is, what do you believe about Jesus? And he said, well, we believe that Jesus was a great man, a great rabbi, a great teacher, and he did wonderful things, but we can't accept him as Messiah because he didn't fulfill all the Old Testament prophecies that talked about what the Messiah would do. You might be surprised at that answer because as Christians, we're aware of all kinds of prophecies Jesus fulfilled. Practically everything Jesus did was in fulfillment of prophecy, including where he was born, the fact that he was born of a virgin, that he caused the lame to walk and the blind to see, that he rode into Jerusalem on the colt of a donkey, that he was betrayed by one of his friends, that he was rejected by his people and pierced through the hands and feet. I mean, so much of Jesus' life and work is foretold in the Old Testament. So what on earth could Moshe and our friends who are Jewish be referring to? And what it comes down to is he and many of them believed that the Messiah was supposed to change the world, the world was supposed to be completely different after he came in a way that everyone would see. And for instance, I'll give you an example. Isaiah 2:4. This is a prophecy that was actually repeated by Micah as well. So it's in the New Old Testament twice. It says, he shall judge between the nations and shall decide disputes for many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And we hear that and we think, well, okay, but why is there still war today if Jesus came and he was Messiah? Why is there still war today? Even in our Christmas carols, we acknowledge this. One of the more well-known Christmas carols says, and in despair I bowed my head, there is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. When Longfellow wrote those words, it was during the American Civil War. His own son had been seriously wounded in battle and hundreds of thousands of brothers killing brothers, and the bloodiest conflict in our nation's history, not even close to the bloodiest conflict in history, though. Because we've already talked about Ukraine and what's going on there, and probably the darkest chapter in our world's history, in our time, is the war in Sudan. The war in Sudan right now has been going on off and on for 70 years, and millions have died. And I think most Americans don't even know about it. And that just shows how dark our world is, how violent our world is. How can we see that happen and say, yeah, Jesus came and brought peace on earth. The Messiah came and fulfilled the promise of Isaiah 2:4. Well, that's what I want to talk about today. We're taking the Lord's Supper, and I want to help prepare your heart for that important observance, but I also want us to reckon with this idea. Did Jesus really bring peace to earth? So here's this famous story, and we're Luke 2:8-20. We hear this every year. And in the same region, there were shepherds out in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. And an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were filled with great fear. And the angel said to them, "Fear not, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. And this will be a sign for you. You will find a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger." And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace among those with whom he is pleased." When the angels went away from them into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let us go over to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has made known to us." And they went with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the baby lying in a manger. And when they saw it, they made known the saying that had been told them concerning this child. And all who heard it wondered at what the shepherds told them. But Mary treasured up all these things, pondering them in her heart. And the shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all that they had heard and seen as it had been told them. I know we've all heard this. I mean, for goodness sakes, this is what Linus says every year in a Charlie Brown Christmas, right? And every year, there's going to be some pastor in our city, probably multiple ones, that preach a sermon on this passage. And I've preached the same sermon in which they say, why were shepherds invited by the angels and not scholars or political leaders or military leaders or other so-called great men? Why these lowliest of low people? And the answer, of course, is that God was sending a message that he came not just for the highest of the high, but also for the lowest of the low. He came for people who have no standing, who have no reputation, who have nothing to call upon in terms of credentials. And aren't we glad? And that is a true message. And I'll probably preach it again sometime. So I hope you forget it between now and then. But that, I believe, is not even the most significant thing about shepherds being at the birth of Jesus. I want to talk about the deeper meaning and what that has to do with peace on earth. When you read the Bible, and I encourage you to do that, I know that's a controversial statement in this place, but yeah, read the Bible, for goodness sakes. But when you read the Bible, what you notice over and over again, one thing you notice is shepherds keep popping up. Shepherds are all through the Old Testament and New Testament. Many of the heroes of the Old Testament, people like Moses, like the very patriarchs of Israel themselves, like Rachel, like David, they came out of the shepherd field and did great things for God. God himself often compares himself to a shepherd in the Old Testament. Of course, we can all think of the most famous example, Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." But then there are less famous, but just as significant passages like Ezekiel 34. Ezekiel 34 is probably not one that any of us have memorized, but it's very significant. It's Ezekiel, inspired by God, criticizing the shepherds of Israel. Not the people who tend sheep, but the metaphorical shepherds, the political leaders, the king and the nobles and the princes, but also the religious leaders, the priests and the prophets. And he's saying, I hired you to be the shepherds of my sheep, but you fattened yourselves on the sheep instead of protecting and providing for them. And I'm firing you as of today. And he says in Ezekiel 34:11, "For thus says the Lord God, behold, I myself will search for my sheep and will seek them out. As a shepherd seeks out his flock when he is among the sheep that have been scattered, so I will seek out my sheep, and I will rescue them from all the places where they have been scattered on a day of clouds and thick darkness." Does that remind you of anything? Maybe Luke 15, where Jesus talks about a shepherd losing his sheep and leaving the 99 so he can find the one. But God here is saying something that would have been a revolutionary thought at the time, which is, I'm the richest person on earth. The cattle on 1,000 hills are mine, but I choose to live with my sheep. And that wasn't done. If you had enough money to own your own flock, you certainly weren't going to spend the night on the cold, hard ground, fending off predators and living in that kind of unsociable environment where really you didn't have contact with the rest of humanity and you were considered ritually unclean most of the time in the temple, so you didn't get to go there either, and you smelled like sheep. It was not a job that anybody aspired to. There's a reason why David was stuck tending the sheep. He was the youngest in the family. But God says, I don't care. I will be the shepherd. Even though I could hire others, they're not worthy. I care about my sheep. And then he goes on in verses 23 and 24 and makes it more specific. He said, "And I will set over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them, and he shall feed them and be their shepherd. And I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David shall be prince among them. Now, you may not have the timeline of the Bible just fixed in your consciousness. I'd be very impressed if you did, but I will just tell you that when Ezekiel sang these words, David's been dead 400 years. So what is he talking about? Well, everybody who heard Ezekiel would have known, because by that time they all understood that God had promised David that someday he'd have a descendant who would reign forever and ever, and that was the Messiah. And so by Ezekiel's time, whenever someone said, hey, I can't wait until we see the Son of David, they were talking about the Messiah himself. And so God in Ezekiel 34 is saying, I'm going to be the shepherd of the people, but I'm not going to be it directly. I'm going to be it through my Son, my Messiah, my anointed one. I will lead my sheep. I will tend my flock. But he doesn't even tell us the best part, the most significant part, and that is how he will rescue us. And that's over in Isaiah 53. Now, I know we don't like to think about Isaiah 53 at Christmas time because we think about a tiny baby in a manger and how adorable and sweet that is. And Isaiah 53 is all about the brutality of the cross. But I want you to see Isaiah 53:6, be reminded of it. It says, all we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. And what he's saying there is something we need to recognize. God couldn't just come be our shepherd by holding up a staff and saying, follow me, everybody. You know why? Because we're terrible sheep. We don't follow. We get lost. We go astray. Every single one of us has turned to our own way. God couldn't just send the Messiah to say, go where I go, do what I do, say what I say, and we would just follow. We're not capable of that. So he had to put himself in our place. The good shepherd would need to pay for the sins of his own sheep. He would need to bear our griefs. He would need to carry our sorrows, be pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. And then when Jesus in John 10 says, I'm the good shepherd, he's saying, I'm that one that was foretold in Ezekiel 34, but also in Isaiah 53. Because in verse 11 of John 10, he says, the good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. Now, I put myself in the shoes of the people who first heard Jesus say that, and I imagine they looked around at each other going, what kind of shepherd does that? I don't know any shepherds that do that. I know a lot of shepherds. Every shepherd I know, they probably said to themselves, if a bear is coming at their flock, if a lion is coming at their flock, if a pack of wolves is attacking their flock, they make a business decision and say, sheep can be replaced. I can get another job. My life is more important than these dumb animals. And they get the heck out of Dodge. But Jesus says, I'm not like you. I'm a different kind of shepherd. I'm a shepherd that loves my sheep more than my own life. Now, we all know that. We all know that when it talks about him dying in our place, by his wounds we would be healed, it's talking about the cross. But what does that have to do with Moshe's question? What does that have to do about whether Jesus brought peace on earth or not? Well, I want to tell you a story that I read recently, and it's a little bit of a long story, so stick with me. And believe it or not, it will get around to answering our question. So I mentioned Sudan a little earlier, and the war over there. There was one of many, many, many tragedies in that war. Years ago, a teenage boy, 16 years old, in Sudan, a young man named Yasser, and some of his friends ambushed a classmate of theirs because he was Christian and because he was from the wrong tribe. They jumped out of a tree and attacked him and beat him with their fists, and they kicked him with their boots, and they hit him with rifle butts, and just for good measure, Yasser stabbed him several times with a bayonet, and they left him to die there on the ground in the darkness. This was what Yasser had been raised to do. You killed your enemies. That was how you upheld the honor of your family and of your God. Yasser grew up with an uncle named Khaled, who was a member of Sudan's intelligence department. He was an officer there, and he was actually Yasser's hero. But then the day came when Yasser was a teenager, and Uncle Khaled came to the family and told them that he had become a Christian. It happened because he had been spying on a church. He'd been going to that church, pretending to be a believer, hoping he could catch some of the members, or especially the pastor, in some offense that he could accuse them of. But one day the pastor had stood up and told a long story about a man who persecuted Christians, and Khaled was convinced he was talking about himself. In actuality, he was talking about Saul of Tarsus. But after church was over, he went up to him and he put a gun to his head and asked him, "How do you know all these things about me? How did you discover my secret?" And the pastor courageously told him the gospel, and Khaled was saved. This enraged his family, and they knew that in order to regain the honor that they would lose in the eyes of their village and their tribe, they would have to put Khaled to death. And so they made plans to murder him. But before they could, the secret police arrested him and put him in prison for the rest of his life. So they did the next best thing. They forced his wife to divorce him and took their kids into their own home and raised them themselves. Now, 2 years later, one of Uncle Khaled's sons, an 11-year-old boy, got very sick and lapsed into a coma. Now, by this time, Yasser, the teenager at the start of the story, he was in college, and he used to drive every day home from his university in Khartoum to their hometown to the hospital so he could pray over his little cousin. But his prayers seemed to do no good. The boy was losing strength and fading further and further away, and soon he would die. One day, 2 Egyptian men came in and asked, "Can we pray for the boy?" Yasser was there by himself with his cousin. He noticed that both of these men had crosses tattooed on their wrists, and he recognized that meant that they were members of the Coptic church, the Orthodox Church of Egypt. Now, he sort of scoffed and said, "Well, your prayers don't mean anything, so do whatever you want to." And yet there's this tiny seed nagging at him that, why would these Christians come and pray for a Muslim boy when I've never even considered praying for a Christian? To his shock and amazement, as they prayed, the color in the boy's face began to change. And soon his eyes opened and he raised his hand as if to say, "Get these tubes out of my throat." Nurses came rushing in, and soon the boy was up, sitting and talking and just fine. It was an actual miracle. So Yasser spent that whole night talking to those 2 Coptic Christians. And in the morning, when he got up before dawn to do his daily prayers, for the first time in his life, he actually prayed to Jesus and said, "Show me what to do." Went out and acquired a Bible, kept it secret from his family, but read and read and read about this Jesus. And one day he confessed to his family that he too had become a Christian. Now they in what they considered a supreme act of mercy, they didn't murder him, but they had a funeral for him and buried an empty coffin as if to say, "We won't murder you, but you are dead to us." Eventually, Yasser became a pastor and is today an Anglican bishop. But one day he was speaking at a conference in Cairo, and when he got done, a man came limping up to him. And the man said, "Don't you recognize me?" And Yasser said, "No." And after a minute of thinking and staring at this guy and his face a little bit deformed, he realized this was Zechariah. This was the Christian boy that he and his friends had tried to murder all those years ago. Zechariah opened his Bible. He pulled out his Bible and he opened it to the front page, to the blank page in the very front. And there was a list of people he was praying for. And at the top of that list was Yasser. And he said, "Because you hated me so deeply, I've always prayed for you." Did Jesus come and bring peace on earth? Absolutely. He didn't do it like so many other prophecies Jesus fulfilled. He didn't fulfill it the way we thought he would. How would you bring peace to a troubled region? You'd go in with a great show of force, and you would put to death anybody who was causing trouble, anybody who was hateful, anybody who was violent, anybody who had something against someone else, and you would leave nobody but the peace-loving, harmonious people. And if Jesus had done that, which he well could have, there would have been nobody left. Because I hate to tell you this, but the sweetest person among us, the most saintly grandmother that you know, apart from the Spirit of Christ, has hatred in her heart as well. Every single one of us. That's us. That's the human condition. So Jesus didn't come and bring peace on earth like we would. He came and brought it one heart at a time. He came and he died in our place, and then he said, "Follow me and you'll see." And every one of us, when we're changed by that act of mercy, that gift of grace, we walk into a life of peace. Last week, we talked about the peace that Jesus brings with our circumstances, how we can live without fear. But this is peace with our fellow humans. This is peace with God, but peace also with our next door neighbor and our sibling and our coworker, and even the person that by nature we would hate. That's the peace he brings. And many people could give testimony, maybe not as spectacular a testimony as Yasser, but you could say, there once was a time when I was just an angry person, when I carried around all this rage inside me, when I would lose my temper at the drop of a hat, when I had this bigotry and prejudice against certain groups that I just thought was righteous indignation, or when I was a bitter person who refused to forgive and just carried these grudges. And the Lord came into my life and changed all of that. And I'm becoming more and more a peacemaker the longer I live. And the way he did that was by taking all the anger and the violence and the hatred in this world upon himself. He swallowed it up. It consumed him. And yet he nailed it to the cross, according to Colossians 2:15. 3 days later, Jesus rose, but your anger and your rage and your hatred stayed on the cross if you trust in him. And that's why today we remember, as we take the Lord's Supper, we remember it was his evil. It was our evil that destroyed him, but it also was his love and his grace that replaced our evil with his righteousness, our rage with his peace. And we also look forward to the day when that work is complete, because someday it will be. Revelation 7:17 says, "For the Lamb in the midst of the throne will be their shepherd." That's quite an image, isn't it? A lamb will be our shepherd. And he will guide them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes, because someday all that will be left is those once lost sheep who've been redeemed, and all those who stubbornly refuse the amazing gift of his grace and the peace that he brings. They'll have to face their judgment. And all that will be left is those of us who've been tracked down by the Good Shepherd and redeemed through his blood. And we look forward to that time.